History usually celebrates heroes who fight bravely, die gloriously, and stand firmly for one side. But Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand was not that kind of man. He didn't charge into battle. He didn't die for a cause. And he certainly didn't stay loyal to just one ruler. Yet somehow, this quiet, sharp-minded aristocrat survived the fall of the monarchy, the terror of the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, and the return of the kings, while many stronger, louder, and more passionate men lost their heads. Literally, this is the story of a man who mastered the art of survival, turned diplomacy into a weapon, and proved that in politics, intelligence often outlives courage. This is the life of Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand. Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand was born in Paris in 1754 into an old and powerful aristocratic family. On paper, his future looked secure. Titles, wealth, influence, and privilege were all waiting for him. But fate had other plans. As a child, Talleyrand suffered a severe injury to his foot. Whether it was a congenital defect or the result of poor medical care remains debated, but the result was the same. He walked with a permanent limp. In 18th century France, this single physical flaw changed everything. For noble families, the first son was expected to serve in the military. A man who limped could not command troops, could not ride into battle, and could not represent aristocratic strength. So Talleyrand was quietly pushed aside. His family made a decision for him. He would join the church. For many aristocrats, the church was not about faith, it was a career path. And for Talleyrand, it became the first lesson of his life. Institutions matter more than beliefs. Young Talleyrand was educated at some of the best schools in France. He studied theology, philosophy, classical literature, economics, and, most importantly, human behavior. Unlike many priests of his time, he was not deeply religious. He was observant, skeptical, and quietly ambitious. He learned how power actually worked, who really made decisions, who whispered behind closed doors, how favors were traded, how silence could be more powerful than speech. While others prayed loudly, Talleyrand listened. By his early 30s, he had become Bishop of Autun, a prestigious and wealthy position. But again, he wasn't interested in sermons. He was interested in politics. By the late 1780s, France was in crisis. The monarchy was drowning in debt. The nobility refused to pay taxes. The people were starving. And the old system, the one that had protected families like Talleyrand's for centuries, was starting to collapse. Many aristocrats panicked. Talleyrand did not. Instead of clinging to the past, he did something dangerous and brilliant. He sided with change, carefully. In 1789, when King Louis XVI called the Estates General, Talleyrand was elected as a representative of the clergy. This was a historic moment. For the first time, the old order was being questioned publicly, and Talleyrand saw opportunity. As revolution spread, one issue became unavoidable: money. France was bankrupt. The revolutionary government needed funds desperately, and Talleyrand offered a solution that shocked Europe. He proposed that church lands be seized by the state. Coming from a bishop, this was astonishing. To some, it was treason. To others, it was a practical genius. Talleyrand argued that church property was meant to serve the public good, and that saving the nation justified the sacrifice. The proposal passed. The church lost vast wealth. The revolution gained financial oxygen, and Talleyrand gained a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. A man willing to betray institutions to survive history. As the revolution intensified, politics became deadly. Radicals demanded purity. Moderates were accused of weakness, and loyalty was tested not by words, but by blood. Talleyrand stayed calm. He supported reform, but avoided extremism. He spoke carefully. He voted strategically, and he never tied himself completely to any single faction. When violence increased, many revolutionaries doubled down. Talleyrand did the opposite. He prepared an exit. By 1792, France was no longer just reforming, it was devouring itself. The monarchy was collapsing. The guillotine was becoming political currency. Friends turned into enemies overnight. Talleyrand read the signs. Before the terror reached its peak, he left France. First to England, then later to the United States. This wasn't cowardice. It was a strategy. In America, Talleyrand observed a new kind of power. A young republic, cautious but confident, idealistic yet practical. He studied American diplomacy, trade, and political restraint, lessons he would later use brilliantly. But exile was not easy. He was stripped of titles, declared a traitor by some, suspicious to everyone. Still, he survived. At first, the partnership worked beautifully. Napoleon conquered. Talleyrand stabilized. Napoleon inspired fear. Talleyrand reassured. Together, they transformed France from a revolutionary state into a dominant European power. Talleyrand helped negotiate key treaties. The Treaty of Campo Formio, reshaping Italy. Diplomatic arrangements that isolated Austria and weakened Britain. Agreements that gave France breathing room between wars. Behind closed doors, Talleyrand often acted as a brake on Napoleon's impulses. He advised moderation, balance, stability. Napoleon listened, sometimes. Despite their success, the two men were fundamentally different. Napoleon believed history was shaped by will. Talleyrand believed history was shaped by limits. Napoleon wanted total dominance. Talleyrand wanted equilibrium. To Talleyrand, a strong France did not mean a France surrounded by enemies. It meant France respected enough to maintain peace when necessary. This difference would eventually tear them apart. In November 1799, Napoleon staged a coup, the 18th Brumaire. The weak revolutionary government collapsed. Napoleon became first consul, and Talleyrand, he supported it. Not because he loved Napoleon, but because he understood reality. France needed a central authority, and Napoleon was the only one capable of holding it. For his loyalty, Talleyrand was rewarded handsomely. Wealth, titles, influence, and unprecedented access to power. By 1804, when Napoleon crowned himself emperor, Talleyrand stood at his side. But something had changed. As Napoleon's power grew, his patience shrank. He stopped listening. He dismissed caution as weakness. He treated diplomacy as an extension of war. Talleyrand watched carefully. He saw warning signs everywhere. Endless military campaigns. Humiliated allies turned into future enemies. An empire expanding faster than it could be managed. To Talleyrand, this wasn't strength. It was overreaching. And overreach, in politics, is fatal. The break between Talleyrand and Napoleon was not dramatic. There was no public argument, no shouting, no immediate betrayal. It was quieter and far more dangerous. Talleyrand simply stopped believing. Privately, he began to think Napoleon was leading France toward disaster. And privately, very privately, he began to prepare for a future after Napoleon. Historians often call Talleyrand a traitor, but Talleyrand saw himself differently. In his mind, he was loyal, not to a man, but to France. As Napoleon pursued endless wars, Talleyrand secretly communicated with foreign powers, including Austria and Russia, not to destroy France, but to limit Napoleon. He believed that a controlled defeat would save the nation from complete collapse. It was a dangerous game. If discovered, he would have been executed. Napoleon was not blind. He knew Talleyrand was disloyal. At one point, in a furious outburst, Napoleon famously insulted him, calling him a pile of dirt in a silk stocking. Yet Napoleon did not remove him. Why? Because even Napoleon understood something terrifying. There was no one better. Talleyrand knew Europe. He knew every court, every ambassador, every weakness. Removing him would weaken the empire. So Napoleon tolerated the betrayal. For a time, this is where Talleyrand becomes most controversial. Was he a patriot trying to prevent catastrophe, or a self-serving survivor positioning himself for the next regime? The truth is uncomfortable. He was both. Talleyrand believed that regimes are temporary, but nations endure. And he believed his role was to guide France safely from one ruler to the next. Whether that belief justifies his actions remains debated to this day. By 1808, Napoleon's empire was cracking. Spain erupted in rebellion. Europe united against him. The costs of war spiraled. Talleyrand resigned as foreign minister, but not from influence. He stepped back into the shadows, watching, waiting. And when Napoleon marched east toward Russia, chasing glory and destiny, Talleyrand knew the end was coming. In politics, timing is everything. And Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand had an almost supernatural sense of when history was about to turn. By the time Napoleon marched toward Russia in 1812, Talleyrand already knew the truth. This was not a campaign. It was a mistake. Napoleon's invasion of Russia was massive. Over 600,000 soldiers, drawn from across Europe, marched east under the banner of empire. Napoleon believed sheer force would end resistance. Talleyrand believed geography, weather, and human endurance would end Napoleon. He was right. As the French army pushed deeper into Russia, the land itself fought back. Scorched villages, endless distances, brutal winter, starvation, and disease. By the time Napoleon retreated, the Grand Army was shattered. Fewer than 100,000 men returned. The myth of invincibility was broken, and Europe took notice. Talleyrand did not panic. He did not celebrate. He waited. As Allied armies closed in on France, Talleyrand positioned himself not as an enemy of Napoleon, but as a realist. He opened discreet channels with Austria, Russia, Prussia. His message was simple and carefully crafted. Napoleon is not France. This distinction mattered. Foreign powers did not want chaos. They wanted stability. And Talleyrand offered them a solution. In 1814, Allied armies entered Paris. Napoleon was still fighting, still hoping, still refusing to accept reality. But in Paris, power had already changed hands. And at the center of it stood Talleyrand. Rather than resist, he welcomed the Allies, not as conquerors, but as negotiators. Inside his mansion, diplomats gathered to decide the future of France. Talleyrand did something extraordinary. He engineered the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, the same royal family the Revolution had destroyed. Louis XVIII would return as king, not because Talleyrand loved the Bourbons, but because they were acceptable to Europe, and acceptable meant peace. Napoleon abdicated soon after. Exiled to the island of Elba, the empire collapsed, and somehow, against all odds, Talleyrand survived again. Not only did I survive, he thrived. The new king appointed him foreign minister once more. The same man who served the monarchy, then the revolution, then the empire, now served the restored kings. To critics, this was proof of betrayal. To Talleyrand, it was proof of relevance. Europe gathered in Vienna to redraw the map after 20 years of war. France should have been punished. Instead, something astonishing happened. Talleyrand turned a defeated nation into a diplomatic equal. At the Congress of Vienna, France was supposed to sit quietly. Talleyrand refused. He argued that legitimacy, not conquest, should guide Europe's future. This was bold and brilliant. By defending legitimacy, Talleyrand aligned France with conservative monarchies, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, against excessive punishment. The result? France kept its borders, avoided occupation, and re-entered European politics as a respected power. For many historians, this was Talleyrand's greatest achievement. No armies, no battles, just words and timing. In 1815, history twisted again. Napoleon escaped Elba. He returned to France. The army rallied. The king fled. The 100 Days began. For a moment, everything Talleyrand built was at risk. Did he panic? No. He stepped aside. He refused to support Napoleon, but also refused to fight him. He waited, because he knew something Napoleon refused to accept. Europe would never allow his return. After the defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon was gone for good. This time, exiled forever. When the Bourbons returned again, Talleyrand was still standing. Older, more cautious, but unmistakably indispensable. France was exhausted. 25 years of revolution, terror, empire, and war had left the country bruised and distrustful. Kings had fallen. Crowns had been remade. Loyalties had shifted too many times to count. And now, after Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo, the monarchy was back, for the second time, walking on dangerously thin ice. Many wanted vengeance. Royalists demanded punishment for those who had served the revolution or the empire. Names were drawn up. Old grudges resurfaced. The air was thick with the promise of purges. Talleyrand pushed back. From his quiet rooms and careful conversations, he argued that France could not survive another wave of bloodletting. Revenge, he warned, would only reopen wounds that had barely begun to close. The nation did not need justice driven by rage. It needed stability driven by restraint. He urged the king to rule over the French, not against them. No mass executions, no sweeping reprisals, no attempt to turn back time. France, Talleyrand believed, had bled enough. Instead, he worked to ease tensions between former enemies, royalists, revolutionaries, Bonapartists, knowing that the future depended on compromise, not purity. His goal was simple but fragile: prevent civil war, reassure Europe, and give France a chance to breathe. Once again, Talleyrand was not the loudest voice in the room. He didn't need to be. Power, he understood, was exercised best in whispers, not shouts. Surviving kings, emperors, and revolutions had taught him one lesson above all others. Nations fall not from change, but from excess. And in the twilight of his career, Talleyrand played his final role, not as a revolutionary, not as an imperial servant, but as a guardian of moderation in a country desperate for peace. By now, Talleyrand's reputation was fixed. To some, he was a genius. A cold-eyed realist who understood power better than anyone else in Europe. The greatest diplomat France ever produced. A man who could sit across from enemies, smile gently, and leave with everything he wanted. To others, he was something far darker. A traitor, a cynic, a man without principles. Someone who switched loyalties as easily as coats, serving kings, revolutionaries, and emperors with the same calm detachment. Both sides were right, and both were wrong. Talleyrand did have principles. They just weren't sentimental. He did not believe in loyalty to individuals. Kings fell. Emperors collapsed. Governments passed like seasons. For Talleyrand, attaching oneself to a single ruler was not virtue, it was blindness. His loyalty was to France, or more precisely, to France's survival. He believed nations should be governed by balance, not passion, by continuity, not purity. Ideologues frightened him. So did men who believed history had a single correct path. He had seen what certainty produced: terror, war, and rivers of blood. So he adapted. When power changed hands, he did not resist it. He shaped it. When old systems failed, he helped design new ones. Not because he lacked morals, but because he refused to die for illusions. To his critics, this was betrayal. To Talleyrand, it was responsibility. He once remarked that treason is a matter of dates. In his world, what mattered was not who ruled today, but whether France would still exist tomorrow, intact, respected, and at peace. History would never fully forgive him. His name would always carry an edge, a shadow of suspicion. But without men like Talleyrand, uncomfortable, unromantic, unsentimental, France might not have survived its most dangerous century at all. At his core, Talleyrand believed a few hard truths governed history. Governments rise and fall. Ideologies flare with certainty, then fade into disappointment. And violence, no matter how righteous it claims to be, eventually destroys the legitimacy it seeks to defend. He had watched this cycle repeat itself in his own lifetime. A monarchy collapsed in blood. A republic devoured its children. An empire conquered half of Europe, only to collapse under its own ambition. Each regime arrived promising salvation. Each departed leaving exhaustion behind. From this, Talleyrand drew a conclusion many found unsettling. Power built on force is temporary. Power sustained by consent, compromise, and recognition endures. This is where diplomacy entered, not as politeness, but as strategy. To Talleyrand, diplomacy was not a weakness. It was the art of preventing catastrophe without firing a shot. It was knowing when to yield a little to avoid losing everything. It was shaping outcomes quietly, long before armies were forced to decide them. When he said, "Treason is a matter of dates," it was not a joke. It was a philosophy. Loyalty, he believed, could not be frozen in a single moment of history. What appeared as betrayal in one year might look like salvation in the next. The true crime was not changing sides, but clinging to a doomed cause while a nation burned. He rejected moral absolutes in politics, not because he lacked ethics, but because he had seen what absolutism produced. Guillotines, exile, endless war. Instead, he believed in outcomes. Was France intact? Was Europe stable? Was another generation spared from slaughter? If the answer was yes, then the method, however uncomfortable, was justified. Talleyrand did not seek to be admired. He sought to be effective. In a century ruled by passion and extremes, he stood apart as something rarer, a man who believed restraint was not cowardice, but wisdom, and that the quiet table of negotiation could be more powerful than any battlefield. Surviving history comes at a price. Talleyrand paid it in full. He was respected, but never loved. Trusted, but never fully believed. Even those who relied on him kept a careful distance, as if his presence alone reminded them how fragile power truly was. He outlived rivals who once mocked him, emperors who commanded continents, and kings who believed their crowns eternal. Time removed them one by one. Talleyrand remained, but he walked alone. Friendships faded. Alliances expired. Gratitude was rare. In a world that celebrated heroes and martyrs, there was little space for a man who chose continuity over loyalty, outcomes over passion. By the time Europe finally settled into its uneasy peace, Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand was an old man living among the ruins of his own century. He had survived revolutions that promised paradise and delivered terror, wars that redrew maps and erased generations, regimes that arrived with thunder and vanished in silence. And yet, survival, he understood, was not the same as victory. The battles were over. The diplomatic chessboard was quieter. The frantic calculations that once filled his days had slowed to a stop. For the first time in his life, Talleyrand had the luxury and the burden of reflection. He could look back and see the cost of every compromise, every silence, every carefully chosen betrayal. He could ask himself whether France had been saved or merely spared for a time. History would argue over him endlessly. But in his final years, reputation mattered less than outcome. France endured. Europe stood, battered but breathing. Perhaps that was enough. Talleyrand never expected forgiveness. He never sought affection. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was survival with dignity. And in a century defined by collapse, that quiet achievement may have been the rarest victory of all. After the fall of Napoleon and the final restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, France wanted one thing above all else: stability. The fires of revolution had burned out. The young radicals were gone, dead, exiled, or disillusioned. The old generals were exhausted, their victories buried under years of loss. The nation no longer dreamed of glory. It wanted peace, predictability, and rest. In this new France, Talleyrand still had influence, but no longer control. He was no longer the man quietly pulling the strings behind the curtain. Power had shifted to younger ministers, cautious kings, and institutions desperate to appear legitimate. Talleyrand was now something else entirely. An elder statesman, consulted carefully, listened to politely, and never fully trusted. His advice was respected. His motives were questioned. When he spoke of moderation, some heard wisdom. Others heard calculation. Decades of survival had taught people to look twice at everything he said. Even when he was right, and often he was, there was always the lingering suspicion that he was playing a longer game no one else could see. And yet, the world was beginning to move past him. Diplomacy was becoming more bureaucratic, less personal. The age of salons, whispered deals, and individual brilliance was fading. Talleyrand, who had mastered politics as an art form, now lived in a system that preferred rules over intuition. Years of calculated survival had left scars on his reputation and on his soul. He had bent without breaking, adapted without surrendering, endured without belonging. But endurance came with isolation. There were few equals left to challenge him, and fewer still who truly understood him. Talleyrand had survived every era of his time, but in doing so, he had outlived it. He was a man shaped by revolution and empire, now standing in a quieter world that no longer needed his particular genius. And perhaps that was the final irony of his life. After mastering the art of survival, he found himself living in a moment where survival was no longer enough. Talleyrand understood something painful long before others did. To be indispensable in politics is to be permanently isolated. The qualities that made him valuable, his restraint, his foresight, his refusal to be swept away by passion, also made him untouchable. In an age that demanded loyalty, enthusiasm, and visible devotion, Talleyrand offered only results. And results, while useful, rarely inspire affection. Friends disappeared one by one. Some died on scaffolds, victims of revolutionary certainty. Others fell on distant battlefields, sacrificed to imperial ambition. Those who survived often kept their distance, unsure whether proximity to Talleyrand was protection or danger. Former allies avoided him. They feared being judged by association with a man whose survival alone raised questions. Enemies feared him more deeply, sensing that he understood power too well to be controlled by it. Even those who benefited most from his diplomacy never fully trusted him. They accepted his advice. They relied on his negotiations. They enjoyed the stability he helped create. But they watched him closely. Talleyrand had seen too many regimes fall to believe that gratitude lasted longer than convenience. He knew that indispensability was temporary, and affection even more so. A man relied upon in a crisis is often resented once the crisis ends. Over time, he ceased to be viewed as a person at all. He became a symbol, not of loyalty, not idealism, but of endurance. In a century defined by collapse, he represented survival without illusion. A reminder that history does not reward purity. It rewards those who adapt, endure, and accept moral discomfort as the cost of continuity. That was the price Talleyrand paid. He lived long enough to see peace return, but not long enough to escape the loneliness his usefulness had created. Indispensable to many, truly close to none, he remained standing at the end of the storm, respected, feared, and profoundly alone. And perhaps that, more than any accusation of betrayal, was the true cost of being indispensable. Did Talleyrand regret his choices? He was careful with that question. Publicly, he never allowed doubt to show. He remained composed, ironic, and meticulously controlled, the same man who had survived courts, revolutions, and empires by revealing as little of himself as possible. Regret, if spoken aloud, could be interpreted as weakness, and weakness, in his world, was dangerous. So he said very little. But privately, the record tells a more complicated story. In his letters and memoirs, a different Talleyrand emerges, not confessional, not sentimental, but aware. A man who understood that survival had demanded sacrifice, and that some losses could never be recovered. He acknowledged, indirectly but unmistakably, what his choices had cost him. He had traded emotional connection for strategic distance, conviction for flexibility, belonging for survival. He had lived among the powerful for decades, yet belonged fully to none of them. Intimacy was replaced by caution, friendship by calculation. Even moments of warmth were filtered through the question that governed his life. Is this safe? There were no dramatic apologies, no final renunciations. Talleyrand did not believe history rewarded such gestures. But there were pauses, hesitations in his writing, silences between events, that suggest an awareness of what might have been. Moments when the rooms grew quiet, when the voices of the past returned, when survival no longer required action, only memory. In those quiet moments, the cost of the trade became clear. He had preserved France through chaos. He had shaped peace when others demanded punishment. But he had done so by standing apart, always observing, rarely joining. Publicly, Talleyrand remained the same, measured, distant, unreadable. Privately, he carried the knowledge that while he had survived history, he had not escaped it, and that some victories, however necessary, leave behind a silence no diplomacy can ever negotiate away. Late in life, Talleyrand did something unexpected. He sought reconciliation with the church. This was the same church he had once stripped of its lands. the same institution he treated as a career rather than a calling. To some, it looked like hypocrisy. To others, it looked like a man trying to close unfinished chapters. Was it genuine faith or political instinct? Even at the end, perhaps it was simply human. A man who had outlived certainty, looking for peace. France was changing again. New politicians emerged, less shaped by revolution, more shaped by compromise. They lived in a world Talleyrand had helped create, but no longer controlled. He watched quietly as ideas he once supported were reshaped, diluted, or forgotten. This was the final irony of survival. To live long enough to become a historical reference, not a participant. As Talleyrand aged, stories about him grew sharper, darker, and simpler. History prefers clear villains and heroes. Talleyrand fit neither role. So writers, politicians, and historians flattened him into something easier to explain. A traitor, a cynic, a man who served no one but himself. The truth was more complicated and less satisfying. Strip away the myths, and the record is undeniable. Talleyrand prevented the total dismantling of France after Napoleon, reinforced diplomacy as a counterweight to military ambition, helped establish a European balance that avoided continent-wide war for decades. These were not small achievements. They were structural, invisible, and because they worked, they were easy to forget. Idealists are remembered fondly, even when they fail. Realists are remembered coldly, even when they succeed. Talleyrand understood this better than anyone. He never pretended to be pure. He never claimed moral superiority. He believed politics was not about virtue, but about consequences. And he accepted that history might never forgive him for choosing results over righteousness. In his final years, Talleyrand lived quietly. No coups, no betrayals, no dramatic reversals, just conversation, writing, and reflection. The man who once shaped Europe now watched it move on without him. And perhaps, for the first time, that was enough. How should history judge Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand? As a villain? A hero? A survivor? The answer is uncomfortable. He was a mirror, a reflection of politics without illusions. He showed what happens when intelligence replaces passion, when calculation replaces faith, when survival becomes the highest virtue. If Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand had died young, history might have been kinder to him. But he lived too long, long enough to offend everyone, long enough to outlast heroes and make them uncomfortable. By the end of his life, almost every political group had a reason to dislike him. Royalists never forgave his revolutionary years. Revolutionaries never forgave his royal service. Bonapartists never forgave his betrayal of Napoleon. And yet, none of them could deny his brilliance. Talleyrand inspired a rare kind of resentment, not the anger reserved for tyrants, but the bitterness reserved for people who are always right too early. Kings distrusted him. Generals despised him. Idealists loathed him. Because Talleyrand exposed an uncomfortable truth. Most political disasters are avoidable, but avoiding disasters doesn't make legends. No enemy shaped Talleyrand's reputation more than Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon admired strength, loyalty, and boldness. Talleyrand embodied restraint, ambiguity, and patience. To Napoleon, that looked like weakness. Their relationship ended in open contempt. Napoleon accused Talleyrand of corruption, cowardice, and treason. He famously mocked him in front of court officials, calling him a silk stocking filled with mud. But even in hatred, there was respect. Napoleon never executed Talleyrand, never imprisoned him, never fully cut him off. Because deep down, Napoleon knew Talleyrand understood Europe better than he ever did. One of the most common accusations against Talleyrand was corruption. He accepted gifts. He profited from negotiations. He lived luxuriously. To modern audiences, this feels shocking. But in 18th and early 19th century diplomacy, it was normal. Ambassadors were expected to enrich themselves. Negotiations often included personal incentives. The difference with Talleyrand? He didn't hide it, and he succeeded. That success made people uncomfortable. No quote follows Talleyrand more closely than this one. Treason is a matter of dates. To critics, it proves his cynicism. To supporters, it proves his realism. What Talleyrand meant was simple, but brutal. Loyalty to a collapsing regime is not virtue. It is denial. History rewards those who understand when a system has already failed. That idea alone ensured his legacy would remain controversial forever. In the end, Talleyrand became exactly what he always was. A man history needed, but never wanted to celebrate. He prevented disasters that never made headlines. He softened defeats that could have destroyed nations. He outlived systems that believed they were eternal. And because of that, his legacy remains unsettled. Not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a warning and a lesson. A warning about what happens when ambition ignores limits, and a lesson about the quiet power of restraint. Talleyrand forces us to confront a truth we'd rather avoid. Sometimes the people who save the world don't look like saviors at all. Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand survived monarchy, revolution, empire, and restoration. Not because he was the strongest, not because he was the bravest, but because he understood when history was changing, and when to change with it. And that may be the most unsettling form of intelligence of all.